Standing in This Place is a community arts project by me, Rachel Carter, based on the historic research of Bright Ideas Nottingham and the Legacy Makers. We're going to tell the story of women working in the Midlands textile mills and the enslaved working in the cotton fields in the Americas and the Caribbean.
Hello, I'm Sian Trafford of Nottingham Women's History Group, and we're thrilled to be asked by Rachel to do this today. We made Rachel's acquaintance a while ago, and she came on our walk, Ladies, Lace and Lawbreakers, written by my colleague here, Mo, who we'll talk in a moment, and asked us to do this podcast, and we were absolutely delighted.
Oh, I'm very pleased. and Mo?
I'm Mo Cooper. I'm a Nottingham-based community historian, semi-retired really, and I've been involved in the Women's History Group since the beginning. And yes, it was after we did our walk around the lace market that we talked a bit more about the connections with every strand of history, really. Every historian in Nottingham needs, when they're reviewing things, to think in the wider global sense. And this really sort of pulled on those threads. So, yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the work we've done.
Taking a walk around the lace market area of Nottingham, we paused outside the National Justice Museum and took a look at this fabulous building across the road. Really, you can imagine how sumptuous it would have been to live in that. But then there's also a story you told us about, a lady that lived in there, wasn't there?
Yeah, it's one of those buildings that you wouldn't tend to notice unless you're pointing at it on a walk, and it is looking quite sad. But it used to be the archives, Nottinghamshire Archives, before they moved to the canal. And it's a Grade 2 listed building on the opposite side to the Galleries of Justice. And it appears to have been built during the 17th century, or aspects of it. Before the Civil War. It's got connections with the Civil War. Some people will know about Colonel Hutchinson, who lived at the castle during the war. And it was his mother, Lady Hutchinson, who lived in this house around 1646, we believe. And she's very wealthy. Total contrast to the women we've been talking about so much. And I think that's one of the things about the lace market. You've got high pavement, and where all these grand ladies, these fair ladies, would have lived. But she lived there, and she liked a bit of a party, really. So very strict in Nottingham at the time, and she would play music on a Sunday in her house, having a right old time. And so she was taken and prosecuted at the court for breaching the Sabbath, really. So, she was a bit of a character. But the building itself, if you ever notice it, it was used as judges' lodgings from the mid-19th century right up to when the archives took over it in 1966. But it's just one of those sort of quite interesting little houses along the way.
Well, it's interesting to think, you've got this, very fancy lady living in a fancy house, but then, she falls foul of the law by playing music on a Sunday. But then she's not got far to go to be prosecuted.
No.
Out the door, across the road, into the court, get your fine.
Well, it's pretty dodgy, because you've got St Mary's up the road, who the vicar of St Mary's, which probably was the Reverend Wilkins around this time, he was later, but they were the custodians of morality, really, as the Anglican Church there. So she should have known a little bit better, really.
Oh.
But Nottingham is full of lots of stories about eccentric women. That fortunately, a lot of those, we found information through council day books and things. Especially about the women that used to live at the castle in the apartments there before the revolt and attack on the castle in 1831. So it's always nice to sort of give that a nod to them and not depress ourselves so much about the state of the working classes. There's a lot more domestic architecture in Nottingham. I mean, you've got back-to-backs still in the city centre, which would go for a pretty packet nowadays, I tell you. It's sort of spending a bit of time looking at these buildings and imagining who lived there and what was it being used for. And it's not all about the grand mansions.
Yeah, and I think that's what was beautifully illustrated on your walk and talk, you know, that we went from, you know, little dwelling houses to you know, those huge fancy ones, you know, and chapels and pubs. We went through that sort of broad spectrum of society in a small area.
Yeah. Well, when we started the Women's History Group, we were told, we can't run a walk around town. There's nothing to talk about. There are no famous women from Nottingham. And in fact, one of the things I sort of say going over Maid Marian, well, that's the most famous woman from Nottingham, a fictitious character. But actually, that's because nobody had really done much looking before. Yeah. And I think there is the other point that women's history isn't necessarily the history of famous women. Mm. I do a talk called The Good, the Bad and the Reality, which looks at, you know, famous good and bad women, but also talks about the reality of the daily grind of workers, mothers, you know, sort of what that's like. And it's important for us to talk about that as much as Robin Hood.
Exactly. So let's take a little creative break, and we're going to hear from Bea Robinson. She's 14 years old and part of the New Art Exchange Yard Youth Theatre Group. And she's going to be reading the memoirs of a lace maker, a Mrs. Clare, who was born in 1892 in Nottingham and worked in the lace trade.
Had your parents told you had to get a job?
No, they never. I just walked in and got this errand girl's job. And it was 4 and 6 a week. And then I'd been there about a month. I used to run these errands for the work people. And it was a farthing's worth of milk, a farthing's worth of this. I used to have to try reckon it all up. Well, being awful at sums, you see, I didn't like that job very much. So, of course, when I was out one day, I was walking up Mary Gate and I saw pattern girl wanted. So I went in and got that job. So anyways, I gave in my notice at the other place and I got this job as a pattern girl. That was 5 and 6 a week.
What did you have to do?
Well, they gave you like a little folder. You used to have to stick these patterns in with gum, you see. The different lengths, and perhaps some were wider than others, you see. As it went down, it was different widths, because that used to have to be sent to the consul for all these lace that were sent abroad. So anyways, I was there for a bit, and then somebody told me of another job that was going. That girl that was leaving in Broad Street, they were shippers, American shippers, and that was for a pattern girl, but that was 8 and 6 a week. So I left to get this 8 and 6, you see. And that's how you used to get your jobs. You used to have to stand on your own 2 feet. But you know, when anybody gave you a rise at these firms, it only used to be 6. 6 they used to put in your wages for a year. Instead of getting 8 and 6. It was 9 shillings next, you see. It was 6 a rise. It was only 6 they used to give you. And you used to think you were ever so well off. So of course, I left there, and then after that, a friend of mine, a girl that I got to know, she used to work at Thomas Adams, and of course I got the job there. I went to work at Thomas Adams to be with her, and that was doing net tucking on machines, you know. When these nets came in, sometimes they were ever so springy. When it went through the machine, sometimes tucks didn't run straight. If you didn't do it proper, they wouldn't pass it, and you'd have to buy it when you're done out of your own wages. You used to have to. Of course, we were on our own time, and if you only earned perhaps 8 or 9 shillings a week and got to pay for this piece that was wrong, I mean, you didn't get that much at the end of the week. Sometimes it was only about 2 shillings.
What did you do with the money you earned?
Do with the money I earned?
Did you give your mum any?
When I first started out, I did. I mean, when I got my first 5 shillings a week, I used to have to take about 2 shillings a week out for myself and give the rest home, you see. But anyways, I was going to say, the money you earned after mother and father died, I used to buy all my own clothes out of that, and it was only about, say, 6 shillings a week, 6 or 7 shillings a week. And you used to have to buy your own shoes and buy your own clothes and buy everything out of that. But mind you, material that you used to buy, I always used to remember buying some material from Cranes in Hockley, and it was 1 shilling a yard. Well, it only took about 2.5 yards, for a dress, for a little whipper like me, you see. And I always remember it was green and trimmed with navy blue. And I used to look quite posh with this little green dress with navy blue piping.
Thank you, Bea, for that amazing reading of a Nottingham lacemaker. And that takes us nicely to the next woman from Nottingham history. And that's a fascinating lady called Esther, who marries a gentleman called George Africanus. On our walk, we passed St Mary's Church in the Lace Market, and you explained about a gravestone that's recently been rediscovered and alongside a new plaque. They're an interesting couple, Esther and George, aren't they?
Yes, there is. There's a plaque on the railings of St Mary's Church to George and Esther Africanus. George had been enslaved from Sierra Leone. He was born in 1763. We don't really know how he became a free man, but he came to Nottingham in the 1780s. And he bought property on Chandler's Lane, which is close to Nottingham Marketplace, and married local woman Esther Shaw in 1788. They had 7 children, although they didn't all survive to adulthood. And Esther, with George, ran an employment agency for servants, and they owned property in the area. And indeed, there's a blue plaque in recognition of this that was installed on Pelham Street in Nottingham.
Yeah, there was a project run by a local community group called Belong, a black-led community group that do lots of different projects, but they had a heritage angle, and they ran a very good project funded by Heritage Lottery, which ended up with the plaque, the blue plaque, but also they did a lot of outreach and education, because I think a lot of people know about George Africanus in Nottingham, but there's still people who don't know much about it, and it's an interesting tale, and it's an interesting tale about interracial marriages as well at that time. I mean, there's been a recent project called The Colour of Love, which was about interracial marriages in the 20th century, sort of post-Second World War mainly. Fascinating, lots of interviews with people about their lives. But we're going back to sort of 1788, and we won't know what their lives were like, but the Belong Project did interpret quite a lot. They had a little model, I remember, of the house they would have lived in and things like that. But this was a very well-respected free man, and it was hard to become a free man, because there's 2 terms here. There's the free man in terms of slavery, but actually I think he was a free man of the town as well. So he was respectable, and he did, if you look at the project that Belong did, they found lots of interesting artefacts, articles, and he was taken, at one point he took his son-in-law to court, so feeling quite comfortable and accepted in the business and middle-class community. So I say there's a sort of, it's an interesting story and something that everyone should be aware of. Yeah. That this was 1788.
Yeah, and am I right in remembering that George and Esther ran the employment agency, and their children as well ran it for 70 years in Nottingham? That it was going for some time.
Yeah. And that's how people got their servants, really, is quite often going to agencies. So he used his experience of being a servant, a paid servant, to run this agency.
Gosh.
And I think he also owned property, if I recall, which again, anybody owning property at that time was quite remote. I mean, even in the 20th century, property ownership was very, very slight throughout all the classes.
It's interesting to think about that them as a couple on so many different levels, but then on a personal level, where I've found a lot of my female ancestors that next to on the census it says in service, and I can just imagine them going to see George and Esther Africanus and saying, I want a job in service, and they're and interviewing them and then placing them in maybe one of these well-to-do houses up in the Lace Market near at the National Justice Museum. It's been such a fascinating episode to record with you both. I think I could sit here and talk to you all day about fascinating women from Nottingham, but we've run out of time. So if we've inspired any of our listeners to find out more about women's history or the history of Nottingham, could you signpost us to some places, some resources that listeners might be able to access?
Well, I'm going to butt in straight away and mention Nottingham Women's History Group website. So just Google Nottingham Women's History and it'll come up. We have lots of resources on there and links. There's a self-guided suffragette walk. There's a list of women from Nottingham. We call it the list of notable women, and it's about women from all walks of life and indeed all sort of time periods. I think we come right into the 20th century. So there's just a little short biography about each one, just a few lines. And I would mention again that we've got the poems of a Nottingham lace runner, Mary Bailey, the booklet introduced by John Goodridge and published by Five Leaves Bookshop, to read about the life of a lace runner, so a lace embroiderer. And there's also a book by a woman called Eliza Sarah Oldham. She wrote a novel called By the Trent, and she set that in the Lace Market area as she remembered it as a girl. Now, and she was born in 1822, so it is of a period. So you could try looking for that, By the Trent by Eliza Sarah Oldham. And it's set around the same time as Mary Bailey, who was living about half a mile away at that time. That's what I would recommend to get you going.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I think there's so much on the internet nowadays if you're Googling to get information. So you would find more information about George Africanus, about the projects we've talked about. There are walks around town, and some of them are quite accessible. Some of them are a bit expensive and more geared towards tourists. But People's History Group, which is a radical history group, they recently reenacted the attack on the castle and talked about, again, the history of workers and activism. There's I Do walks around town and other areas that will always have a focus on working class history rather than the fancy men, the notable men. So there's always opportunities to learn. I mean, the Women's History Group run events where there's talks, and again, they're always very accessible talks where you can learn about different aspects of women. So there's one looking specifically at Florence Boot, because again, Jessie Boot, father of the city, gets all the publicity, not a word about our Florence, who was a fantastically interesting woman and an equal partner in that business from the start. But she did lots of radical work, employed the first welfare officer for a woman in her factories in the 19th century. And also we'll be doing a talk at Nottingham Local History Association
Open Day Forum, I can't remember what they call it anymore. That's out at Ravenshead on the 29th of October. And that, I hope, is going to be quite an interesting talk. It's about plaques for women and about plaques that actually already exist in the city. And there are more than I thought. Still not enough, obviously, but more than I thought. And they're all different. There's only about 2 or 3 blue ones. So they come in all shapes and sizes. So you could sign up for that. Look at, just Google Nottingham Local History Association Open Day or Forum on the 29th of October, and you'll find out how to sign up for that.
Wonderful.
And I think the Nottinghamshire Local History Association, if you've got a general interest in history and you want to learn more about your area, if you go on their website, they tell you all the local history groups. Yeah, there's lots of ways you can engage with local history. And there are these cross-city or cross-county organisations that would look at things like archaeology. I mean, archaeology in Nottingham is fantastic. So there's ways and means, and WAs often run courses as well. And WAs, quite often there's an income threshold, so you can generally get on it for free.
Yeah.
I did loads of courses during lockdown with them. So yeah, lots of possibilities. And if you're going to history walks or talks and they don't mention women, ask them.
Yes. Say, well, were there no women here then?
Yeah, because I do get exasperated on going on walks where women are invisible.
Yeah.
I say it's a responsibility. Anyone calling themselves a historian has to look at a wider picture of what is history and who made history.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect end to this episode. You know, we need to talk more about women's history. So I want to thank you both, Sean and Mo, for being such fantastic guests on the podcast. And I think I could feel more episodes coming up soon. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Rachel. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Standing in This Place podcast. If you'd like to find out more, you can head over to my website, rachelcarter.co.uk, or you can head to any of the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube to find out more about the project. Thanks for listening.